March 1941, Mare Island Naval Shipyard, California. A light mist hung over the dry docks as welders worked beneath the skeletons of half-built destroyers. Sparks rained against steel hulls, hissing as they vanished into puddles of oil and salt water. In the chaos of America's frantic pre-war buildup, one man was about to challenge the very logic of the U.S. Navy's industrial machine. His name was William L. Bill Davis, a welder so obsessed with efficiency that his co-workers quietly called him the Mad Machinist. He wasn't an officer, nor an engineer with blueprints and degrees. He was just another man with a torch and an idea that everyone said was ridiculous, an idea that would later save more than 50 million man-hours before the war was done. But back then, in that spring of 1941, nobody listened. What if the most important weapon of World War II wasn't a bomb, or a tank, or a rifle, but a tool that built them faster than anyone believed possible? A single invention, born not in a government lab or an admiral's office, but in a noisy shipyard where sparks and sweat replaced strategy and rank. For the American war machine, time was the real enemy. Every ship delayed meant convoys left unguarded. Every hour wasted in the yard meant soldiers waiting at sea. By 1941, the Navy was bleeding labor, literally running out of hands. A single battleship required over 10 million man-hours to weld and plate. Rivets cracked, torches failed, and each repair meant hours lost to fatigue and error. The government begged for speed. Industry begged for innovation. And somewhere inside that storm, a single welder decided to do what no engineer dared: build a gun the Navy didn't want. He called it the Bernie. A welding torch that could cut and fuse steel twice as fast, using a crude system of oxygen injection and variable nozzle flow, so simple that the Navy inspectors laughed in his face. Too dangerous, they said. Too unstable. You're not an engineer. They stamped the papers rejected. But Davis didn't throw it away. He took it home. In a rented garage behind a grocery store, Davis worked nights, testing, failing, cutting again. He bought scrap metal from junkyards, burned through his savings, and turned every mistake into a lesson. Neighbors saw smoke rising at midnight and called him insane. But he kept going, driven by a single thought. If his gun worked, he could save millions of hours. If it failed, he would lose everything. Then came December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Suddenly, the same officers who dismissed him were begging for faster welding solutions. America's shipyards lit up day and night, and the mad welder from Mare Island finally had a chance to prove them wrong. But he didn't know that his tiny invention would soon spread across every shipyard, reshape naval production, and secretly become one of the biggest time savers in modern warfare. Before the world called it genius, the Navy called it junk. And before it saved the war effort, it nearly destroyed the man who built it. Because somewhere between invention and approval lies the most dangerous battlefield of all: bureaucracy. The camera of history pans upward, over the cranes and smokestacks of California's naval yards and lines, of welders move like sparks along the ribs of unfinished ships, their torches cutting through fog and darkness. Each flare is a heartbeat in the vast machine of war, a machine running out of time. In the center of that storm, Bill Davis lifts his crude welding gun, the same one the Navy rejected. He pulls the trigger. A roar of light fills the frame. Metal melts in seconds. And in that single moment, the mad welder's rebellion begins. The transformation began, quietly. Weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy's West Coast shipyards were drowning in orders. Destroyers, landing craft, tankers, each demanded miles of welds and millions of hours. Sparks lit the docks day and night until the horizon itself glowed red. Amid that industrial storm, Bill Davis walked through the noise carrying a small wooden crate marked only with his name. Inside it was the same crude torch the Navy had thrown out. He had rebuilt it 3 times since the rejection, changing valves, trimming the nozzle, adjusting the oxygen flow until the flame turned white and fierce. It hissed like a living thing. His supervisors barely noticed. To them, he was just another welder clocking another 12-hour shift. Yet every night when the sirens fell silent, he stayed behind. He tested, he measured, he recorded. In February 1942, his experiment crossed a line. One spark, one perfect seam of molten steel, fused 2 plates in half the usual time. He froze, staring at the clean joint. The metal hadn't warped. The edges gleamed like glass. For the first time, he believed it might actually work, but proving it was another battle. To the Navy bureaucracy, innovation meant risk, and risk meant delay. Paperwork buried ideas faster than torpedoes sank ships, so Davis went around them. He carried his invention to a civilian contractor, the Nelson Company, whose foreman, a grizzled engineer named Tom Wheeler, had lost patience with Navy red tape. Wheeler watched the demo in silence as Davis sliced through a test plate in seconds, the air filled with the smell of ozone and burnt paint. "Do that again," Wheeler said. Davis did. The cut was perfect. Within a week, Wheeler's workshop was a laboratory. They modified fuel feeds, swapped brass fittings for steel, reinforced the trigger housing. One prototype became 5, then 10. The welders tested each on scrap sections of destroyer hulls until their gloves smoked. The verdict was unanimous: faster, cleaner, cheaper. By spring, the Nelson Company had quietly equipped half its crews with Davis's torch, now renamed the H-1 Porta-Gun. The Navy inspectors never noticed. The torches looked identical from a distance, but the results spoke louder than any memo. Production time on LST landing ships dropped by nearly 40%. The weld seams were smoother, stronger, and required less rework. Davis stopped sleeping. He drifted through the yard like a man possessed, checking gauges, logging performance numbers, fixing clogged jets with a pocket file. Rumor spread about the mad welder whose gun could melt steel like butter. Some called him reckless. Others whispered that he'd found a secret military fuel. One night, when the third shift ended and the lights dimmed, Wheeler handed him a letter. "From Washington," he said. "Someone's noticed." The envelope bore the crest of the Bureau of Ships. The tone was formal, cautious, an inquiry, not praise. They wanted details, blueprints, safety data. It was the same office that had rejected him a year before. Davis stared at the letter, then looked back at the rows of ships gleaming under floodlights. Every plate welded with his gun meant hours saved, lives accelerated toward the front. He wasn't going to wait for permission again. By midsummer 1942, the H-1 Porta-Gun had spread from California to Virginia. Shipyard workers traded designs like contraband. Some built their own versions from spare valves and plumbing pipe. Supervisors pretended not to see. The war needed results, not paperwork. Then came the audit. A Navy team arrived unannounced. 3 men in white caps carrying clipboards thicker than manuals. They watched the welders time the seams and finally confronted Wheeler. "This isn't standard issue," one of them said. "No," Wheeler replied. "It's better." For once, the data was undeniable. Each yard using the modified torch reported record production. Weld defects fell by 30%. Costs dropped. Even fuel usage improved. The inspectors returned to Washington with samples and field reports. Within a month, the Bureau of Ships authorized experimental adoption under supervision. Davis wasn't invited to the meeting, but he didn't need to be. He could hear the change in the air, the tone of the foreman, the way supply trucks now carried crates labeled H-1 welding unit, approved for trial. At last, the Navy had realized what he had known all along. By November, Nelson Company received its first formal commendation for outstanding contribution to efficiency in ship construction, estimated labor reduction exceeding 50 million man-hours. When the telegram reached Davis, he was back on the dock welding a bulkhead. He read it twice, wiped the sweat from his face, and smiled faintly. The sound of hammers and torches filled the yard like applause. But success carried its own weight. Orders multiplied. The gun he had built with his own hands was now being mass-produced across every coastal yard. Each new batch carried slight modifications, none of them his. He was proud, but uneasy. Innovation, once born in rebellion, was now property of the institution that had rejected it. As the year drew to a close, the Pacific burned with battles. Midway, Guadalcanal, the Coral Sea. The ships Davis helped build were there in the thick of it, their steel seams holding under bombs and torpedoes. Yet the man who made them possible remained invisible, another name on the payroll. Sometimes during night shifts he would stop and watch the convoy lights fade into the fog. Every spark from his torch seemed to carry a fragment of himself into the darkness, a piece of faith that an idea, once ignored, could still change the world. The Nelson Company earned its first star in November 1943. No speech was given for the man who had started it, all but somewhere in the archives of the Bureau of Ships, under a dry heading labeled Efficiency Modifications, Welding Apparatus Classified, lay a note in faded pencil. Original concept by W.L. Davis, field implementation successful. He never saw it. He didn't need to. The proof was already afloat, cutting through the waves toward war. By early 1944, the United States was producing ships faster than the ocean could swallow them. The sound of hammers and welds had become America's heartbeat. In every coastal yard, from Mare Island to Brooklyn, Davis's once rejected welding gun now hung from every rack, its flame lighting the path to victory. Statistics were staggering. Destroyers that once took a year to finish were now launched in 6 months. Every Liberty ship completed ahead of schedule freed another convoy to cross the Atlantic. The Navy didn't count the sparks, and it counted the hours saved. And by conservative estimate, those hours had already surpassed 50 million. But inside the noise of progress, Davis began to fade. His name had vanished from the reports. The official papers listed the invention as Porta-Gun Model H-1A, Naval Production Variant. He read the bulletins in the cafeteria between shifts, seeing his creation mentioned in passing, never his own. The men around him didn't care who made it, only that it worked. To them, the tool was part of the landscape, as natural as the torches they carried since the war began. One evening, as a half-finished destroyer slid into the bay under floodlights, Davis stood near the rail watching it float for the first time. Steam hissed, whistles echoed, and for a moment, he could almost hear the ocean answer back. He thought of the years he'd spent trying to prove an idea. He thought of every laugh, every rejection, every spark that nearly burned his dream down. And he smiled, a quiet, tired smile that only inventors understand. The Bureau of Ships eventually issued a memo acknowledging his early field prototype. Contributions. It arrived weeks after the war in Europe ended. By then, the shipyards were already slowing, the contracts drying up, the workers dispersing. Factories that once built destroyers now built refrigerators and automobiles. Welders went home. Sparks turned to silence. But the gun remained. Its design, copied, adapted, rebranded, and became the backbone of post-war industry. Every bridge, every pipeline, every aircraft frame carried a trace of his innovation. His crude, Bernie torch, born in frustration, had become the ancestor of modern arc welding tools used worldwide. Somewhere deep in the archives, engineers cited his ratios for heat flow and gas compression, without ever knowing the man behind them. He had changed the world quietly, one seam at a time. Years later, during a veterans reunion at Mare Island, an old foreman recognized him. "You're that crazy welder, aren't you?" he said, laughing. Davis just nodded. The foreman raised his glass. "You built half the Navy, Bill. The rest of us just held the torch." He didn't reply. He looked toward the harbor where rusting hulls lay moored, relics of a war that had outlived its heroes. He could still smell the faint trace of burned metal in the wind, a scent that had once meant progress. Time had moved on, but every factory that followed bore his fingerprints. Welding schools taught the H-1 technique. Naval cadets studied it as standard procedure. The same method that once drew laughter now defined an era of production. When questioned about it years later, Davis said only, "They called me mad because I believed there was always a faster way." Maybe madness is just another word for seeing what others refuse to. In 1953, on the anniversary of VE Day, a small article appeared in a California newspaper. It mentioned that the inventor of the Porta-Gun had passed away quietly in his sleep. No ceremony, No headlines. The last line read, "His tool remains in service." The world moved forward, but the numbers told the story he never could. 50 million man-hours saved, thousands of ships built, an empire of steel sustained by one man's defiance. And somewhere, in every spark that lights a torch today, his idea still burns, a flame born from rejection, carried by those who refuse to stop building. When the war ended, the world exhaled for the first time in 6 years. The shipyards fell silent. The cranes stood still. For the first time in memory, the ocean no longer echoed with hammers and sirens, only with gulls and wind. In Mare Island, the same dock where Bill Davis had once tested his strange torch now lay rusted and empty. Weeds grew between the rails where steel once slid into water. Victory that filled newspapers had no room for. The names written in grease and sweat. The admirals were remembered. The welders were not. Yet every man who ever held that torch carried a story. Some called it superstition. Others called it pride. But there was something about the sound of that flame, the way it hissed before melting steel, that made them pause. They said it sounded almost alive, almost human. In time, Davis's invention became ordinary. Factories copied it. Patents expired. The tool that had saved 50 million hours became another line item in a catalog. And yet, when welders compared their new torches, they still used his name. "This one's built like the Davis gun," they'd say, never knowing the man, only the myth. The Bureau of Ships eventually archived the file under obsolete equipment. But inside that folder lay one photograph, a man in overalls, squinting against the light of his own creation, surrounded by sparks that looked like falling stars. No caption, no credit, just a date, 1942. It's strange how history remembers. It builds monuments for generals and footnotes for builders. But every monument that stands today, every bridge, every ship, every city skyline, owes its bones to those quiet hands behind the flame. If you ever walk past an old shipyard at night and hear a faint crackle of metal, you might imagine it's just the wind. Or maybe, for a moment, you'll wonder whose fire still burns in that silence. Some say the war was won by courage. Others say it was won by science. But there's another truth, one harder to measure, and even harder to admit. It was won by stubbornness, by people who refused to stop when everyone else said it couldn't be done. That's the part of history that doesn't fit neatly into books, the small defiance, the uncredited spark. The idea that changes everything but carries no name. And maybe, just maybe, that's what keeps the flame alive. Decades later, a historian writing about wartime innovation came across Davis's records. He was surprised to learn the Navy never patented the device under its original name. The question he wrote in the margin was simple. Who decides what counts as invention? The man who imagines it or the institution that accepts it? Nobody ever answered him. But perhaps that's why this story still lingers, because somewhere out there, someone's working on an idea right now, one that everyone else will laugh at, one that will be called reckless, impractical, even mad. And years from now, when that idea changes everything, nobody will remember the name. History will only remember the results, just like it remembered the ships, not the hands that built them. Sometimes, progress doesn't roar. It hums quietly and steady, relentless, like the flame of a welding torch beneath the wind. The same hum that once echoed through Mare Island still runs through the factories and shipyards of today. The same rhythm that drove men to build, to refuse defeat, to believe that a single spark could save time, and perhaps even lives. Bill Davis never lived to see how far his idea spread. But in every steel beam that holds a city together, in every ship that cuts through the Pacific, and in every worker who believes their craft matters, he lives on. Because some inventions don't just save hours, they save belief. And that's the part of war and peace that no statistic can measure.